Tested.
Martin eigentlich, ja? Ja, das frage ich mich auch.
Martin.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm the master of ceremony for the afternoon, and I'm sorry to be late already at the beginning, but it's never a good idea to cross the building of the Schola if you are in a hurry. So many people which have to talk to you immediately at this moment. Now I switch to my role. I would like to introduce and welcome Piotr Wilk, who is coming from Kraków, and for you, Torelli, Torellisti or Torellini, I don't know what your name is, the crew of interested people and musicologists and musicians in the work of Torelli, well known. He's there at the university as an associate professor, and I can just read here what you are doing. You're chief of the Musica Jagiellonska journal, member of the editorial boards of the Encyclopedia Musica, Polish, I can't really pronounce, complete works of Wieniawski and so on. And he had worked a lot on editions of 17th century violin music, Uccellini, and monographs on Vivaldi and Venetian concertos. And the topic of today, you can see, it's what already was a little bit started in the papers before by Johannes, at least, how these new musical genre, concerto, sonata, what the names are not so clear, especially in opus 5, 6, and 8 from Torelli, what we can learn from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. Since the days of Joachim Quantz and Charles Barney, Giuseppe Torelli has been widely acknowledged as the inventor of the concerto. This privileged position of the Bolognese composer has been confirmed by contemporary research, but as a result of several criticisms of his compositional technique, his works are today not equally valued as concertos by Corelli, Vivaldi, or Tartini. For anyone who has ever played or studied Torelli's music, Arthur Hutchings' opinion from his until recently quite influential monograph is shocking. Michael Talbot, who has contributed greatly to the study of his legacy, did not help to increase interest in Torelli's concertos, as he allowed himself to use similar expressions. According to him, Torelli was not good at constructing larger forms because he did not use ritornello forms, which were crucial for the development of the concerto. It's high time to verify these heartful opinions and to better recognize Torelli's contribution to the crystallization of the new genre. The collection Sinfonia a tre e concerti a quattro, opus 5, Bologna, 1692, is generally considered to be a fundamental position in the history of concerto. In this publication, for the first time in the history of music, with regard to the 6 pieces bearing the term concerto, Torelli explicitly suggested their performance with multiple instruments per part. He later repeated these recommendations in opus 6 and 8. It's clear from comparing sinfonias with concertos that the latter contrast with polyphonic sinfonias, that means sonatas, with their homophonic texture, 4-part scoring, and completely different form. In 2 works, the composer used 3-movement form, fast, slow, fast, for the first time. The others have the 4-movement form, slow, fast, or the 5-movement form, fast, slow, fast. Although, in the case of the latter, it's obvious that here too is a 3-movement cycle with a 3-phase slow middle movement, slow, fast, slow. The individual movements of the opus 5 concertos are still very short, ranging from 3 to over 60 bars, and generally flow attacca one into the other, as suggested by Volta or Segue Subito remarks, and the half cadences at the end of the movement. Torelli experiments not only with agogic plans and macro forms, but also with the structures of individual movements. It sometimes happens that entire movement is dominated by one musical idea. Or within a full-composed structure, one can notice a repetition of the beginning material at the end of the movement. Most of the slow movements are short preludes, interludes, or postludes to the fast movements. These do create a tempo contrast, but the piece is clearly dominated by the energetic fast movements. From the point of view of the development of the concerto, the most noteworthy movements are those in which Torelli uses motto form or ritornello form, The two structures that rhetorically organize the concerto's musical narrative in the most convincing way, highlighting the contrast between tutti and solo. The presence of these forms in the first publication containing concertos was not as obvious and proves Torelli's far-sighted compositional sense. It's worth mentioning that in the first concertos of other pioneers of the genre, such as Stradella, Corelli, Gregori, Motta, there is no point in looking for similar examples. The introduction of the motto and ritornello form into the concerto is all the more surprising because there is no division into tutti and solo sections in the works. After all, there are examples of concerti ripieni. Let us first look at the finale of the concerto opus 5, number 6. It has a structure that we can consider a regular ritornello form, and in addition, the soloistic treatment of first and second violins is no different from that in the double concertos from opus 8. Despite the lack of the terms tutti and solo, in this case, we can talk about real solo episodes placed between tutti ritornellos. The opening ritornello is a closed period with a binary structure. It consists of two themes, the second of which is repeated as a dynamic echo, followed by a solo for two violins leading through a relative key to the dominant. At the end of the second ritornello, there is a new theme modulating to the relative key, with which, after the second episode, the last ritornello begins. The tonal plan of this part is symmetrical, with two relative key appearances. There is also a regular ritornello form in the inner section of the three-phase structure of the middle movement of the same concerto, in which two short adagios envelop the central allegro. Here, the opening ritornello is an open period followed by the first solo episode, returning to the tonic. Unlike in the finale, the tonal plan of the movement is pendulum-like, and the whole structure of this form is divided into 3 episodes and 4 ritornellos. The concerto, opus 5, number 6, clearly shows that, contrary to Talbot's claim, Torelli used ritornello forms and was able to apply closed periods in the ritornello too. In addition, such forms already appear in his debut collection of concertos. Such early examples of ritornello forms were not isolated in Torelli's oeuvre from the early 1690s. In Sinfonia a quattro con tromba e violini unisoni, giggling 4, the opening allegro is also in the regular ritornello form. This work was copied a year after the publication of the opus 5 concertos. In the Archivio di San Petronio, it was preserved with a double set of strings, which corresponds to the recommendations from the preface to the opus 5. All Sinfonia ritornellos are closed periods. They open with a very attractive motto, the author of which could have been Vivaldi or Albinoni, and which turned out to be a paraphrase of the fugal theme from the violin sonata opus 5, number 8 by Pietro degli Antoni. An even earlier and very interesting example of Torelli's use of a closed period in ritornellos is the second movement of sonata opus 3, number 11. It indicates that the idea to combine the ritornello and fugal forms was born by Torelli already in 1687. Although in this a quattro sonata there are no solo tutti markings, as in the opus 5, the second movement has a quite plastic form composed of 3 fugal ritornellos separated by thematically and texturally contrasting sections, which can be considered a prefiguration of the solo episodes. The piece foreshadows the later fugal ritornello forms from the opus 8 concertos. Torelli's next publication of concertos comes from his German period. This time, the composer has already devoted the entire collection of Concerti Musicali, opus 6, Augsburg, 1698, to a single genre, and compared to the opus 5, has taken a step forward in crystallizing the concerto form. Of the 12 works included in the opus 6, 2, number 6 and 12, are the first ever violin concertos. The others, like those in the opus 5, belong to the concerto ripieno type. As many as 8 pieces, including the violin concertos, are in the modern fast, slow, fast 3-movement form, while the remainder are slow, fast, 4-movement forms. Unlike opus 5, where the concertos were distinguished from the sonatas by the dominance of homophonic texture, now Torelli doesn't shy away from counterpoint and even introduced fugal movements. In comparison to the concertos from opus 5, the forms of individual movements are only slightly extended. The significant increase in size applies to the slow movements, which now become more independent, and not only in solo concertos. The cantilena of the first violin clearly contrasts expressively with the fast movements. In most of the concertos, Torelli doesn't use ritornello-like forms in any movement, which should not be surprising, considering that these are concerti ripieni. Such forms are also very rare in Vivaldi's ripieno concertos. In the opus 6, the fast movements are sometimes fugal, composed with recapitulation, or built on the motto perpetuo principle. Few ritornello or motto forms can be found in both 3-movement cycles and 4-movement forms, in both solo concertos and ripieno concertos. Despite, as in the opus 5, despite the lack of the terms solo tutti, also in some pieces from the opus 6, there are ritornello structures with sections resembling solo episodes. Looking at the forms of the fast movements of the two violin concertos, it's difficult to see any significant progress in them compared to the concertos from opus 5. An undoubted step forward compared to opus 5 is the clear prominence of the soloist only against the background of the bass in the sections identified as solo, and the extending of these sections in relation to the episodes from the forms described above. Compared to the final movement of the concerto opus 5 number 6, the opening allegro of the violin concerto opus 6 number 6 may seem a step backwards, as first ritornello is a triple repetition of the motto with modulation to the relative key, rather than a binary closed period. It's in the listener's auditory perception, however. The question of whether ritornello is a unary, binary, ternary, relatively closed or open period is rather less important than whether there is a clear scoring and or thematic contrast between the ritornello and episode. In both ritornello forms described above, such a contrast occurs, and the boundaries between what is played tutti and what is played solo are clear. Looking at opus 6 from the point of view of the crystallization of the concerto form, at the macro level, there is a definite move towards the 3-movement structure that would become the norm of the genre starting from the first decades of the 18th century. In this collection, Torelli even abandoned his characteristic 3-phase slow, fast, slow, middle movements. In this collection, we recognize the richness of formal and tonal approaches typical of Torelli's technique and the tendency to constantly experiment and surprise the listener. The tonal plans of the ritornello or motto movements do not differ from those of opus 5 in terms of the number of keys visited. Usually in one movement, the composer visits from 2 to 4 keys. In extreme cases, there are 5. And in the course of a movement, not only the main key may be repeated. Despite this stylistic variety, opus 5 and 6 demonstrate that in the 1690s, Torelli was the first and the only one composer to introduce ritornello forms so definitely and on such a scale into a newly created genre. At that time, such forms were not used by his colleagues from Bologna, Venice, and Rome, not to mention composers from outside Italy. After his return from Germany and Austria, Torelli went on to compose a wide variety of concertos, as evidenced by dozens of manuscripts preserved in the Archivio di San Petronio and the posthumously published collection of 12 concerti grossi, opus 8, Bologna 1709. As for opus 8, Torelli surprises as never before with the repetition of the former models used. Here we can speak of a clear standardization of the concerto form. All 12 concertos have fast, slow, fast, 3-movement forms. Prior to Torelli, only Albinoni was so clearly in favor of the 3-movement form in his opus 2 and 5. Vivaldi, in his debut L'Estro Armonico, used it in 8 out of 12 concertos. The slow movements of as many as 8 of Torelli's opus 8 concertos are his characteristic 3-phase slow, fast, slow structures. Albinoni also used such forms at the time in 6 works from his opus 2 and 5. Compared to opus 5 and 6, in the opus 8 concertos, Torelli significantly increased the size of the individual movements. While in the previous opuses, the fast movements were on average 50 bars long, and the longest ones were up to 70 bars long, now these values have been doubled. Only Vivaldi was able to construct such extensive movements in the first decade of the 18th century. The vast majority of the fast movements in the opus 8 concertos have fully developed ritornello forms. Such structures also occur in the middle movements of as many as 5 concertos. This is a great novelty in Torelli's concerto publications, and the first such examples in the music literature. Before opus 8, Torelli tested the ritornello form in the slow movement only in the Sonata con strumenti e tromba giggling 1, dated 1690, but there it was placed third within the 4-movement slow, fast form. As many as 4 concertos from opus 8 have ritornello structures in all movements. No one had written such concertos before Torelli, and they occur sporadically after his opus 8, mainly in the concertos by Locatelli, Tartini, and Tessarini. In terms of the number of ritornello forms used, 26, opus 8 is unrivaled among collections published in the first decades of the 18th century. Torelli's clear preference for the ritornello form in his last opus was a greater promotion of this form than Vivaldi's L'Estro Armonico, where such forms appear only 16 times out of 12 concertos, and only in the first movements of the concerto. In opus 8, it's also difficult not to notice the significant evolution that Torelli's ritornello forms underwent in the last period of his career. Compared to opus 5 and 6, the opening ritornellos of the opus 8 concertos are longer and more interesting. They usually consist of 2 or 3 themes, but there are also some more complex ones. Of particular note are instances of fusion of ritornello form and fugal form, in which the ritornello is monothematic but very attractive. Here, Torelli creatively develops an idea from his sonata opus 3, number 11. This time, however, he builds much more extensive forms ranging from 60 to 140 bars, where the solo episodes are longer than the ritornello, more exposed and virtuosic. It happens that in both external movements of the concerto there are fugal ritornellos. In the both fugal movements of opus 8 number 10, 2 musical words seem to meet. In the first movement we hear an archaic sounding canzona-like theme. And in the finale, on the other hand, there is an extended and lively andamento theme characteristic of the era of Handel. In the light of the surviving sources, it seems that Torelli was the first to combine the ritornello and fugal form. After him, many composers took up the idea. For example, Alessandro Scarlatti, Albinoni, Vivaldi, Leo, Durante, and Johann Sebastian Bach, amongst others. As in previous collections, also in the Opus 8, ritornellos with open periods clearly predominate, leading not only to the dominant key, but also to the mediant. While we can talk about far-reaching standardization in terms of macro and micro forms, it's impossible to find two movements built on the same tonal plan in the entire collection. Torelli likes to experiment and surprise the listener with sudden, unprepared tonal changes based on the principle of harmonic hiatus. In Opus 8, along with enlarging the size of individual movements, the composer has also significantly expanded the tonal range, in extreme cases visiting as many as 6 keys in one movement. We find here both pendulum and solar tonal planes, in both of which a frequent phenomenon is the return of previously visited tonal areas, usually dominants, sometimes subdominants, sub or supermedians. Torelli's great achievement are his solo episodes. Compared to his Opus 5 and 6, the episodes in Opus 8 are among the longest and most virtuosic. In the double concertos, the composer doesn't follow the patterns of the concerti grossi of Stradella and Corelli, and doesn't operate the two soloists as a compact concertino choir opposed to a tutti choir, but treats them as independent interlocutors dialoguing with each other. This method of using several soloists is also cultivated by Torelli in his concertos preserved in manuscript. And it was in his footsteps that Vivaldi's followed in l'Estro Armonica and his other concerti con molti strumenti. As the size of the movement increases, so does the number of solo episodes. In place of the 2 or 3 of Opus 6, there are now up to 5 episodes, although the composer usually uses 3. Compared to the previous concertos, the episodes themselves are also longer. On average, they last about 20 bars, but the longest ones reach over 50 bars, which is more than many movements of the concerto from Opus 5 and 6. The level of technical requirements placed on the soloist is also changing dramatically. When the violin concertos Opus 6, number 6 and 12 were written for well-educated amateurs, then in the solo episodes from Opus 8, Torelli used a virtuoso violin technique visible only in some of his solo sonatas or in the violin sonatas by Corelli and Lonati. Here we found advanced chordal or polyphonic playing, arpeggio, bariolage, staccato, and playing in high registers. In terms of violin technique, the concertos from Opus 8 by Torelli are among the most difficult of those published in the first decades of the 18th century. In this respect, no published violin concertos by Vivaldi compared with them. Only Locatelli's collection L'Arte del Violino, published in 1733, and Vivaldi's concertos preserved in manuscripts require a more advanced violin technique. The Opus 8 concertos are among Torelli's most major orchestral works, some of the most interesting examples of the genre created in the first decade of the 18th century, thanks to the significant expansion of the size of the piece, the standardization or formal solution, the move away from the ripieno concerto to the solo and double concerto, the reinforcement of the expressive contrast between the solo and tutti sections, and the introduction of attractive themes realized homophonically or in a fugal manner. In artistic terms, they can successfully compete with the works of Corelli and Vivaldi. Contrary to Talbot's thesis, Torelli not only used ritornello forms, but did so on a much broader scale and with more creativity than Vivaldi showed in his first attempts. In the light of detailed comparative research, among the first generation of concerto composers, Torelli appears as the figure who has the greatest merit in crystallizing the major form of the Baroque concerto. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Piotr. We are running a little bit out of time, but it should be possibly for a question. I have one short one. Perhaps not only to you. Do we know anything exactly about the reception of Torelli's prints? Where can they found nowadays? Who used them?
Yeah, we don't have so many prints of Opus 5, 6, and 8. As I remember well, we have 7 examples of Opus 5. They were printed in Bologna, Venice, and Amsterdam. We have 5 examples of Opus 6. They were also published 3 times in Augsburg, Amsterdam, and Venice. And we have also 5 examples of Opus 8, which was printed just once in Bologna. So if we compared it with, for example, with Opus 6 by Torelli, we have 42 examples. So all together of Opus 5, 6, and 8 by Torelli, we have just 17 examples. So according to me, that's why we don't have still much interest in performing this music. We don't have still, except Opus 6, we don't have still a critical edition. And for me, it's especially injustice for the Opus 8 concertos, because they are very mature, very good concertos. So I'm very happy that we have recently made a recording of the complete collection of Opus 8, but we need more work to do. We need to prepare the critical edition.
Thank you very much, Peter. I just wanted to make a comment, because it's very interesting to look at Torelli in this perspective of the ritornello form, and it's very interesting to see he could do everything, so to speak. But if we discussed this with Johannes before, it's really interesting. I have the feeling he still wanted to give a lot of variety in his structure, right? So he has still this older mentality, so to speak, not to just reproduce a model, but to think of a different solution and solely begin and so on. So this is why, for me, it's so interesting, this music, because you can find a lot of fantasy, a lot of different nuance, different solutions, not just the same tutti solo, tutti blah, blah, blah. What is your impression in this regard?
Yeah. This same impression, I had this same impression. And if we compared all the 3 collections, Opus 5, 6, and 8, of course, all of them were printed in different contexts. They were dedicated to different mecenas. And the Opus 8, which I told that it was the most standardized, as we can talking about the form, a collection of Torelli's oeuvre, is because it is last opus, maybe his testament. It was written for Bologna musicians, but if we compare his manuscript concertos, sinfonias, and sonatas from San Petronio archive, dated in 18th century, 1708, 07, 05, there is a big variety, and that's why maybe his music has so bad reception in 20th and 21st century, because he is unpredictable. And we were slaves of so-called evolution ideas that, for example, composer like Torelli must start with Opus 5, then to improve his technique in Opus 6, and the coronation will be Opus 8. Somehow, I agree that the Opus 8, for me, what is subjective, is the most interesting. but we can't see such evolution in his oeuvre. So it's his landmark that he's unpredictable. He likes to experiment, and he likes to play with listener and performer.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
This is a good last sentence. We go to the next speaker, and I wondered why I have to be the master of ceremony in the afternoon. Then I remarked the name of the next speaker. I will fail. He told me for Marc Vanscheeuwijck. You have heard the name? It's okay. If you hadn't heard, this is most important. The next speaker, University of Oregon, Conservatoire Royal de Bruxelles. He is, of course, well known as a player, Baroque cellist, as well as a musicologist, now emeritus, and he has published a lot about San Petronio in Bologna, on Corelli, and cello stories, and so on. It's a very huge output as musicologist, as well with recording CD. You can find them easily everywhere. And now, with his paper, we will come again a little bit closer to Torelli, I think, with the idea of the pieces Torelli had composed for San Petronio, these large-scale compositions. We will hear a little bit, I think, this evening. This is always a challenge for every ensemble. And we will hear also a lot about the performance practice, which popped up in the recent papers as well. And now we will put it in the focus. Thank you, Marc, for coming.
This, but since I inserted my sound examples in the PowerPoint, there's always a problem between PCs and Macs. So I hope the sound will come out anyway. In any case, thank you so much, Agnese, for inviting me to participate in this great Torelli Day, I would say. And so, since we're a bit late, I'll get going right away. Traditionally, the Bologna School has been associated primarily with trumpet concertos by Torelli, Iachini, Gabrielli, and Aldrovandini, and more recently with its hallmark large-scale vocal instrumental compositions for 8 or 9 soloists, double choir, often trumpets, strings, and continuo, called the colossal style by some scholars. Although the instrumental compositions represent only about 12% of the total musical output for San Petronio, during the last 30 years of the 17th century, roughly the years in which Giovanni Paolo Colonna was maestro di cappella, the large-scale compositions in stile concertato are a little more representative of the real San Petronio repertoire, which is about 60% of the total output. We also should not forget the numerous smaller scale compositions, usually for 1 to 4 solo voices with or without ripieno choir, and a more traditional double choir repertoire in stile antico, which is about 30% of the output. So in my presentation today, I'll focus exclusively on the large-scale instrumental music compositions with trumpets by Giuseppe Torelli. In a building as vast as the Bolognese Basilica of San Petronio, which has a reverberation time of approximately 12 seconds when empty, as well as other peculiar acoustic phenomena, the use of dense counterpoint might seem absurd, and this alleged impracticality has been the cause of much speculation and many questions regarding performance practice. In my work on the late 17th century repertoire in San Petronio, I came across some striking stylistic differences, not only in the music of the various personalities who wrote for the church, but also as a consequence of the specific position or rank of these musicians within the Cappella Musicale. For example, the differences between the compositions of cellist Petronio Franceschini and those of chapel master Giovanni Paolo Colonna are striking. Torelli, however, as a tenor violist and as of February 1701 concertmaster, only provided festive instrumental music. I mean, for San Petronio then. After a few biographic highlights regarding Torelli's positions in San Petronio, a short overview of the architectural specificities of the church, most particularly of the choir, I'll discuss the presumptive location of the musicians as it applies to the large-scale compositions with trumpets by Torelli and its reflections on performance practice issues. My sources for this are a mix of partly autograph and copied score and part materials, payment documents to the musicians preserved in the archives of the Fabbriceria, the vestry board of San Petronio, iconographic evidence, not too much of it, unfortunately, a number of important secondary sources, including Francesco Passadore's excellent catalog and Eugene Enrico's 1976 booklet on the orchestra at San Petronio in the Bologna, in the Baroque orchestra. Among others, and my own experience performing solo and continuo cello in the recording of the 30 concertos, sonatas, and sinfonie with trumpets by Torelli, present in the musical archives of the Basilica, recorded on location in September-October 1992 with the orchestra of the Cappella Musicale di San Petronio, directed by Sergio Vartolo. And these 3 CDs are, I think, still available. Giuseppe Torelli applied for a position as viola player in the Cappella Musicale on 28 September 1686. He had been in Bologna for 2 years already as a sort of freelance musician, and he was also already a member of the Accademia Filarmonica. The same day, Torelli was elected for the job by the 4 members of the Fabbriceria, replacing the recently deceased tenor violist Geminiano Buosi, or Bosi, or Berosi. We find 3 different spellings. In all likelihood, Torelli gave up his position at the Cathedral of Verona to study composition with Giacomo Antonio Perti in Bologna, where on 27 June 1684 he had been accepted into the Accademia Filarmonica in the class of instrumentalists. He had already appeared as a violinist among the paid extra musicians for the celebrations of San Petronio on 3 and 4 October 1684 and 1685. And only beginning on January 1st, 1687, was he appointed to the regular position of tenor violist in the Basilica. Torelli stayed in the Cappella until 20 November 1689, almost without interruption, having been granted a salary increase on 23 March 1688. Despite the strict regulations about absences, he received permission from the vestry board to take a leave of absence in early 1690 to stay in Parma for the festivities of the Duke's wedding. In June 1690, he was back in the Cappella and playing for the liturgy until the musical chapel was temporarily disbanded on 16 January 1696 for financial reasons. Indeed, the vestry board needed to spend all of its funds on the long overdue restoration of the aisle roofs of the Basilica. Although it has been hypothesized that Torelli worked in San Petronio only sporadically, the payment documents in the archives of the Basilica indicate that in a period of 9 years, he was only absent for a total of 18 months, usually during the winter months. After the Cappella was reinstated on 25 February 1701, Torelli returned to Bologna from an extended sojourn in Vienna and Ansbach, which we already heard of this morning too. As first violinist of the Cappella, he was now paid per service rather than monthly, which was a much more lucrative arrangement for him. Except for his cantata Lumi Dolenti Lumi for Good Friday and a Benedictus, Torelli's contributions as a composer to the San Petronio liturgy were exclusively in instrumental music. The musical archives of the Basilica still preserved more than 80 sinfonie, sonate, and concerti, of which only 3 are dated from his first Bolognese period, the period between 1686 and 1696, while several large-scale compositions with trumpets and oboes belong to the last 8 years of his career in Bologna. When he was first appointed in San Petronio under Maestro di Cappella Giovanni Paolo Colonna, he collaborated with some of the top musicians in the city. Through his membership of the Accademia Filarmonica, and his participation in their annual celebratory liturgical service in San Giovanni Monte, Torelli also worked closely with other Bolognese musicians, including Giacomo Antonio Perti, his former mentor and Colonna's successor in San Petronio as of December 1695. Perti utilized several of Torelli's sinfonie as overtures for his concerted masses and inserted instrumental pieces and arias of Torelli's in some of his own oratorios and operas. So I suppose you all know San Petronio, which was actually built starting in 1390, but what we have here is just the nave, because the original plan was a little more ambitious, and it was basically stopped by the Pope in 1562-63, who built the Archigymnasio so close to it that the church could not be expanded. We have to realize that the popes in Rome were building San Pietro at that point, and that Arduino Arriguzzi's plan here would have been larger than St. Peter. Size matters, apparently. So that was blocked by Pius IV. Then we have, the size of the church is just phenomenal. We're talking about a vault that is 44 meters above the ground. The width of the church is 51 meters. The length is over 140 meters, only for 6 arcades. So we basically have arcades that are 20 by 20 square meters, which is quite colossal when you think about it. And then in the 6th arcade is when finally in the 17th century, mid-17th century, the chapel was built and the walls were actually closed. And then the organs, which were already much older, were added to it. To give you an idea of the size too, the baldachin is 27 meters high. So the total volume of the church is over 350,000 cubic meters. Think in musical terms what that may represent. So from the back of the choir, you see the old organ here on the left by Lorenzo di Giacomo, an organ builder from Prato, organ finished in 1475. And then the new organ on the other side from 1596, new organ by way of speaking, because they still call it l'organo nuovo in Bologna, by Baldassare Malamini, which was built especially to do double choir music at that time. And then the two organs were actually switched because the old organ was on the left side in Corno Evangeli, and then Giovanni dal Corno, the father of Giovanni Paolo Colonna, Antonio dal Corno, Colonna, the father of Colonna, who was actually not just chapel master, but an organ builder as well. They switched the two organs when the whole wooden construction was completed. Just before Maurizio Cazzati was hired in 1657 to reform the chapel, kick out all the nepotistic traditions of musicians and started with a new kind of orchestra, probably the earliest string band as a church orchestra in Europe in 1657. And then, being a foreigner, he was basically pestered out to the point where he had to even start his own printing business to get his music, across. Then they hired, after long hesitations, they hired the Bolognese Giovanni Paolo Colonna, who was then in charge from 1674 until his, I wouldn't call him an enemy, but almost, Perti, was hired after him when he died in 1695. So here you see the two organs again with so in between the two organs, they're about 24 meters. And from where I'm standing to take this picture in the back of the choir, there's about 25 meters to each of the organs, which obviously in a space that large has strong consequences. If you play music compared to what you hear, you're late by about a quarter of a second. In any case, the choir, as I've enlarged it here, so you have the organo di concerto, which is on the corno Evangeli, which is the main organ, if you want, whereas the organo di ripieno is the old organ, even though it's actually a more interesting instrument. And so here we have the corridori, so those hallways, if you want, that are about this wide, with a balustrade that is about this tall, maybe a little lower than this. And those corridori continue in the back of the church, and then you have an elevated sort of platform, which is above the winter choir that is underneath. Why am I saying this? Because it's pretty important to see the organization of the musicians, obviously. And then what we have here is a larger space where most probably the ripieno choirs were located. And how do we know? Well, we have a few images. This is one of the insignia of the Anziani in Bologna for a festivity that took place in 1722. So it's a little bit later, but it still gives some information. We see the rows of violinists in the back, two rows that are probably sitting on the higher level here, or standing, most probably. We see theorbos, we see bass violins played downwards. That's actually a representation of what they do now. But here we can see on the left side, you see those instruments. You know, some people would claim these are violoncelli da spalla. No, they're just violoncelli or violoni, played resting on the balustrade so that the sound could come out. Because if you sit down behind the balustrade, you play for yourself. The sound is not going to happen outside. Double basses are tall enough nowadays for cellists who cannot play standing, which is not very historical. They put, high little palchetti or something so that the cellist can be elevated and play sitting. But that's not what they did at that point. I'll come back to some of these images. Anyway, based on the part books, or just parts of Torelli's 30 concertos, sonatas, and sinfonie that have survived in the musical archives of San Petronio, we can at least reconstruct some performance elements. My first example from Torelli's first Bolognese period is, let's see, here. The Sonata 5, Due Trombe and e Violini Unisoni del signor Giuseppe Torelli from 1692. Yes, that's the one. The Giggling number 15. And you see the distribution of the part books that we have in manuscript. Among the pieces for one trumpet, strings, and basso continuo, there is still also the Sonata con strumenti e tromba of 1690, with only 11 separate parts. In this one, there are actually 26. stop it here. This was actually Ed Tarr playing in those almost live recordings we did back in '92 in the church in San Petronio with just a few microphones in the center of the apse standing. So, since it was an almost live recording with not much time to do 33 concertos, sometimes the ensemble is not what we would like in the end. In any case, in this sonata we have only, this is the Sonata 5 con tromba with 35 separate parts. However, since there are 2 parts for trumpet and at least 2 parts of the first organ, these could in fact be 2 sets of parts for 2 different performances. An additional feature of this last sonata is the fact that in the grave, the second movement of 5, the autograph score mentions diviso in 2 cori di strumenti. This is going back and forth between the 2 sides constantly. Big violin solo or duet. That typical middle movement section in which you have 2 largos and then a violin solo here, of course, a violin duet, because there is 1 violin on each side of the church by each one of the organs, which is not easy to get together in that space. From Torelli's second Bolognese period, that is beginning in February 1701, we do not only notice the definitive disappearance of the tenore viola as a 5th part of the string ensemble, but there is henceforth a regular appearance of a couple of oboes in the ensemble. However, not as part of the orchestra, but rather as a soloist in opposition to the trumpets. Even in the compositions without oboes, but with 2 trumpets, numbers of parts vary from 20 to 42. Since there is no time here to discuss them all, I'll pick one example again, the Sinfonia con trombe e 2 oboi, o 2 oboe, and e 4 violini obbligati e 4 violette obbligate del signor Giuseppe Torelli, the Giggling 31, which has 28 plus 14 parts. In the smaller set, there are 4 copies of the trumpets, which should be omitted from the total, but in the larger set, no oboe parts appear. So the 2 sets definitely somehow interacted with each other. We can't talk about a first and a second or later version. And you see the distribution right there. All those plus 1 organ in the smaller set. And this is a piece that Perti then used for one of his masses later on. so forth and so on. Talking about ritornello form and harmonic stability, we have a good example here. Now, how were all these musicians placed in the cantoria? Based on the available iconography, we can certainly posit that the main continuo group was always standing close to the organo di concerto, the one on the left. That is the new 1596 Malamini organ in corno Evangeli, or on the left side of the choir when looking at the apse. That means besides the organist, at least a violoncello, violone, a tiorba, and possibly more of each. Upper strings were standing in one of two rows in the back of the apse, and in addition, the soloists, whether violins, trumpets, or oboes, could stand either between the continuo group and the strings, or more unlikely at the front of the horseshoe-shaped balcony, but that may have ensemble consequences. In the case of double choir compositions or pieces that have a concertino and the ripieno continuo would stand by the organo di ripieno, the old organ in corno epistole, on the right side of the altar when looking at the apse. Apart from the two large organs, the Lorenzo di Giacomo instrument of 1575 and then revised several times over time with its 24-foot principale in contrabbasso stop, and the new Baldassare Malamini organ of 1596 with its open 16-foot pitched at approximately 460 hertz, and with temperaments that were no longer mean toned but unequally tempered from the 1680s onward. One notices that in general the basso continuo ensemble is rather large. It should also be noted that about 40% and up to 50% of the instruments in large-scale compositions, including theorbos, bass trombones, and sometimes even a bassoon, could be included in the continuo group. Harps and lironi were, of course, no longer involved in the Bolognese area, whereas no harpsichord parts are to be found in Italian churches as opposed to German-speaking regions. As far as both bass instruments are concerned, however, the situation is a bit more complex. We see violoncelli, smaller than today's cellos, taking on often solo parts in sinfonie or concertos by Torelli, Gabrielli, Franceschini, Colonna, Iacchini, etc., but also violone or 8-foot register instruments slightly larger than today's cellos, which are sometimes also reinforced by large double basses or violoni grossi that can go down to G or F gravissimo, that is in the 12-foot register really, in cases where a 16 or 24-foot second or third organ were to be missing. In some rather narrow or small organ lofts, or where the balustrade is too high for cellists to play seated and without playing against that balustrade, violoncelli or violoni could also be played da spalla, that is, hung by a strap from the shoulder vertically or horizontally, or sometimes even resting on the balustrade, as we can see on the images here. In this case, only the bow grip was the bow grip was overhand as violinists use it, while normally all these both basses were played with underhand bow hold, as it has survived in German-style double bass playing. For small-scale sacred music, there is usually a violone part, always in the 8-foot register, or tiorba with the organ. Of course, this wide displacement of musicians with about 20 meters between the two organs and 30 meters almost between the organs and the upper strings in the back of the apse, some acoustical problems occur. In the back of the apse, the sound of the organ reaches the musician's ear with almost a quarter of a second delay, though one gets used to that, and it's sufficient to watch the tactus keeper and play to the motion, not to the sound. However, given the long reverberation time, one should aim to play in an as vocal way as possible without exaggerated accentuation, otherwise we create unnecessary confusion. Indeed, the organs are voiced in a very sweet, non-aggressive fashion, because linear sounds work better in both imitative polyphonic and in cori battenti textures. The church also favors and enhances treble sounds of trumpets, oboes, and violins, whereas low-pitched instruments need to be present in much larger numbers to obtain a functional balance, hence the 40 to 50% proportion I mentioned earlier. Naturally, excessively fast tempos also create confusion, while it is clear from the harmonic rhythm of these large-scale pieces that too many modulations are not ideal in such a space. In the choir, however, where all ecclesiastic, civic, academic, and university VIPs were seated, anything works fine. But in compositions that need to make some kind of divine sound effect on the congregation, seated or standing in the nave, composers need to be mindful of the long reverberation time, use Picardy thirds in loud final minor chords, and reduce the amount of modulations to remote keys. In his large-scale compositions with trumpets, Torelli definitely seems to be aware of such issues. Indeed, his large tutti sections in ritornello forms with trumpet solos have a great effect throughout the church, whereas in the slow movements, sometimes marked as largo e staccato, he dares moving to harmonies as far from D major as B and even F sharp major. These movements, often for a few strings or even violin or cello solos, are probably meant to be addressed at the VIPs in the choir, mainly the members of the Accademia Filarmonica. So they needed to hear whether the composers knew their stuff, because they were sort of the overseeing organ in Bologna. So in conclusion, Torelli's large-scale concertos were most definitely conceived to work in a large space with very specific acoustic conditions. Long reverberation time, 12 seconds when empty, about 9 when filled with the congregation. Spontaneous generation of the major third, audible, hence the Picardy thirds. Empowering of treble parts, etc., where they needed to be performed with attention to these issues. Naturally, when performed with small forces in dry concert hall acoustics, these pieces can unfortunately no longer provide the splendor they were meant to offer in the festive liturgies for the annual celebration of San Petronio. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Marc, very much. I don't look now at the timetable. However, one small question from my side. Is this guy in the middle, is this the battuta?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have, also you mentioned at the beginning, one of your sources are the books with...
The account books,
yes,
of the musician. Yeah.
They mentioned this guy, this position.
Oh, yeah, that's the
Yes.
maestro di cappella.
Yeah.
He's the one who actually has a roll of paper with which he keeps.
Okay, there's no
the
other,
tablatos.
because in other churches like Venice and in Rome, there is an especially battuta keeper,
Right.
paid, had nothing to do with the maestro di cappella.
Right. Well, in San Petronio, because of the distance, they often had a vice maestro di cappella on the other side,
Okay.
who was just keeping the motion, because, you know, if you put those little candlesticks, of which the holes are still there on the balcony in San Petronio, you can't always see across the aisle, especially when in a Vesper service. So.
Perfect. One question.
Thank you very much, Marc. Just one question about the position of the instrument of
Yes.
the cello as a cellist. What is the sound? Because I don't understand exactly the bow. You have a huge instrument, and it seems like the musicians are playing near the frog,
Yes.
and it's not maybe possible to go to the tip.
Yeah, it's possible
What
to
is-
go
yeah?
to the tip, especially when you play on the lowest string. Then otherwise you'll just...
You have huge...
Yeah, but that's why I think the instrument, as it looks in iconography, was lying on the balcony.
Yes, but the role of the
So
right hand, yeah, it's
You can
just
roll
a
the
sustain.
instrument
Okay, so no
so that you can
sustain
bow
with this arm.
No, you
It's
don't
only,
sustain it.
Okay.
Just the right arm is, and you sort of roll the instrument in or out. We have to realize also that all these musicians were trained as violinists,
Yes.
in their youth. If you think of the Bononcini brothers, you know, for me, it would be impossible to hold the cello that way because my world is reversed. You know, my low string is on the wrong side if I play there. But yeah, they're definitely not those little large viola size instruments that have been marketed for 20 years as violoncelli da spalla. These are actually, viole pompose of the late 18th century. These are regular sized Baroque cellos, which, by the way, are always a little bit smaller than the Baroque cello we teach today, which is really the classical cello. We're talking of instruments with a case length of 70 centimeters at the most, whereas the violoni start after 80 or something like that. So the modern cello, or what I call the modern cello, which is the classical cello, which appears in the 1720s pretty much with the Model B of Stradivari, is sort of a perfect, a perfect combination, or a perfect in-between compromise instrument between the violoncello of the Baroque period, which is smaller, and violone of the Baroque period, which is larger. So equal, thanks also to the silver wound string and so forth. So.
But do you still play like that?
Yeah.
Times with your musicians?
We force our students to do so. I'm not capable, but the first year in Brussels, they all have to learn to play in their hand, and then they learn to play standing and walking in procession. And then those who have, some experience with upper strings, they can learn to play a little bit this way too. But nothing like people who use this, paracomando kind of harnesses to attach the violoncello da spalla. That's a modern aberration, I call it. That's not a historical instrument.
But I think you need special assurances for your students, for the instruments.
Yes.
I can imagine. I'm afraid we have to stop here at the moment. We will have a coffee break after the next lecture by Jean-Francois. But first, Marc, thank you very much.
Thank you.
During the installment of Jean-Francois, I can introduce him already briefly. Here in Basel, he is, of course, well known, I think outside as well. He is our trumpet teacher, natural trumpet teacher, in separating him from the many unnatural trumpet teachers elsewhere, so-called Baroque trumpet. He's playing two whole instruments, one hole to blow into, and then the second hole where the tone come out. He has studied in Lyon, where he's still also playing, teaching as well, and he came as a successor here in 2001 of Ed Tarr, and running a very successful trumpet class. And we will hear him and his students this evening. Oops. And he will talk now about the trumpet parts of Torelli. It's a little bit like television as I was young.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This lecture will be dedicated to late Dr. Edward Tarr, who was my predecessor in this institution. He studied with great interest stories, music in archives in San Petronio church in Bologna, because he was a trumpeter first, and had close contact with Franz Kegling, who made the first catalogue of Torelli's works. Published. It doesn't work. Okay. Yeah, published in Basel in 1948. His book about Giuseppe Torelli in the complete catalogue. From Tarr, from 1968 to 2011, published all 13 symphonias with one trumpet, which are complete, and the two with four trumpet by Torelli. All these pieces are available for many years in modern full-text edition by Musik-Akademie or Martin Schmidt. As a trumpeter, he recorded a lot of the trumpet sinfonia by Torelli, especially in the big project organized by Maestro Di Capella at San Petronio, Sergio Vartolo, Marc spoke about in the 19th. He took also very important informations from archivist of San Petronio in the 17th, Sergio Paganelli. So thanks to all these people who helped to come to the light this beautiful repertoire, and for all the elements they provided for my presentation. No, I didn't find nothing. I just read articles of these people. I will use giggling catalog numbers, which are easier for me to memorize as player and teacher of this music, because the new catalog is quite recent and I don't have the numbers in head. As introduction, I will demonstrate and show you the limitations on the natural trumpet compared to violin, because it's not clear for everybody. So we spoke about ETA, Franz Giggling, his catalog. First item of ETA published a very long time. Project. Okay, and now as introduction, I will demonstrate and show you the limitations on the natural trumpet compared to violin. You have the harmonic scale of the instrument above, and the transposition. If we use the instrument, it will be more clear like that. For violin players, perhaps I just blow a few sounds to explain some things specific to my instrument. So. Okay. Ah, filage besser. Oh, okay. Okay. If I play with instrument tune in C, you will have the scale which is above. You listen that we have a arpeggio in the low register and a scale, a diatonic scale in the high, but not with some black notes which are not complete temperate, which is complicated when we play music with other instruments. So that ordinarily do all the musicians at that time, and the composers knew that, we use the 11th harmonic to play in the dominant, in the tonic, if we play F, and have air sharp when we modulate to the dominant. And like that, we have some modulation possible in tonic and dominant. If the instrument is tuned in D, like in music in San Petronio, it gives that transport, so it would be perhaps more clear for violin players. And so at sounding pitch, it's that. So that's very limited instrument. Secondly, I will speak, give a few elements about the context of the use of the trumpet in Italy before Torelli's work. And to speak about the pioneer of the use of natural trumpet. Since the 16th century, the natural trumpet of folged shape was traditionally a signal instrument in cavalry regiments or very army in Europe, so not musical instrument. But it is to notice that it is in Italy first that it became really a musical instrument. During the 16th century, the so-called tradition of trumpet sonata was established by ensemble of trumpets and drums employed by noble people. It consisted to 5-part ceremonial music with additional drum parts. This music was semi-improvised from a sort of tenor given by one of the trumpets with imitation bourdon and a highest part in this clarinet register, which playing melodic patterns. This tradition is partly saved in the manuscript book of Italian trumpeter from the München court, Cesare Bendinelli, 1614. After that, in the first part of the 17th century, an Italian trumpeter employed at the Firenze court, Girolamo Fantini, developed the art to play the instrument in a very musical way, with basso continuo and eventually in ensemble of various instruments. He published the first trumpet method in 1638. It's cut, but we could see modo per imperare a sonari di tromba, very big, tanto di guerra, very big. It's the first rule of the trumpet at that time. Quanto musicalmente in organo, con tromba sordina, con cimbalo e ogni altro instrumento. So it means at the end of the book there is 8 sonatas with trumpet and organ, and we know from Marin Mersenne Harmonicorum that he has played in Rome with Frescobaldi on organ, certainly one of his sonatas. But he said that it could be played with many other instruments. So it seems logical, because if you play such instrument, you can play only short pieces because you are tired very quickly. And when he gives suite of dance, I can imagine that the upper line Fantini played everything. He certainly played with other instruments to have some ritornelle or repeat by violins or chalmai, I don't know. No. So you have possibility to alternate. And I arrived to the next step in the repertoire of the trumpet, San Petronio trumpet music. So the next step was to introduce the trumpet in strings orchestra. In a way, you could have solos or duets of trumpet or trumpets, with basso continuo accompaniment, but some ritornelle with strings to alternate. That was done by composers working in Bologna, because there was an old tradition from the 16th century to require piffari e trombetti to play for high fest days. Maurizio Cazzati was certainly one of the first in 1664 to insert a trumpet part with strings in his opus 35. No, that's Bologna. We have seen this insignia. So this is publication of Cazzati, and it's before he was working in San Petronio, but it's the first printed piece which inserts trumpet. It could be played only with strings. The last 3 sonatas, number 10, 11, and 12, are for 2 violins, but the first violin part could be played by a trumpet. Later, one can find a sonata at 7 in 1618, written by his colleague Petronio Franceschini. It is the first time for me in Italy that we have a sonata for strings with 2 trumpets. Perhaps before, but it's the first piece we come to light until now. So it established a specific type of pieces in the following years to be played for festive sacred occasion before important mass, or secular ones, some academies in Bologna. The Italian sonata contralto or trombe, when it's two trumpets. Composers like Alberti, Aldrovandini, Bononcini, Colonna, Foggia, Gabrieli, Rossi, Iachini, Lazzari, Legrenzi, Perti produced such repertoire in the last decade of the 17th century. And now we arrive to Torelli. Many things were, my colleague said, many interesting things about his large-scale piece before, but here's, I took time to count how many pieces he has written. 17. I give the word Sinfonia, Sonata, Concerto, we will see later. It's not very clear, the names. It changed from one piece to another. So 17 for one trumpet, 11 for two trumpet strings, 9 two trumpets, two oboes, strings and continuo, and two big sonatas with 4 trumpets. One is really for 4 trumpets. We will play in concert tomorrow at general rehearsal this evening, where the 4 trumpets are played vertically, but the other one is more sonata with 2 pairs of trumpets, similar to the sonatas with 2 trumpets and 2 oboes. As archivist Sergio Paganelli was able to differentiate Torelli's writing between his early period in San Petronio, you said us, until 1695, before he went to Austria and Germany, and the later one, after 1701, Edward Tarr could establish with him an approximate chronology in the trumpet music of Torelli. It seems that most of the pieces for solo trumpet are from the early period, even if only 2, G1 and G4, are dated 1619 and 1693, respectively. 3 exceptions on 17 sonatas for one trumpet are G3, 10, and Sinfonia Avanti l'Opera G14. And it is logical because we know from a study of Anne Schoenbellen published in 1969 that a certain Giovanni Pellegrino Brandi was listed in payment records for the fest event at San Petronio from 1679 to 1699. So this guy, for 20 years, was regularly paid as trumpeter, and certainly a lot of the pieces written for one trumpet were played by this guy. About sonata pieces with 2 trumpets, it seems that most of the pieces, at the opposite, most of the pieces for 2 trumpets are from the more recent period. 2 exceptions are G15, dated 1692, and G17, no date, but this archivist, Sergio Paganelli, could see that it's the late writing of Torelli. And it is confirmed by the fact that 2 names appear in the list in San Petronio. 73, Angelino Tromba and Fagotino Tromba, a trumpet player named Fagotino. 74, Tromba, we have 2 names, and it changed sometime the years. And this is in the edition of Ettar. He had this document by this archivist. So it's clear that the piece for 2 trumpets are from the second period. And as oboes are not mentioned in musicians' payment until 72, it could be deduced that all the pieces with trumpets and oboes are from the late period of Torelli in San Petronio. Torelli used different titles for trumpet pieces, Sinfonia, Sonata, or Concerto. It could be a little confusing for us, but it seems it has any specific connection with the musical form itself. For example, in the Sinfonia G27, the score is notated concerto con trombe, oboe, e violini. But in some of the separate parts, trumpet, for example, it is just Sinfonia con trombe. And in some other parts, like violins, it bears the name sonata con trombe, etc. So it's confusing. The form is generally in 3 to 6 movements. But is it sonata da chiesa or concerto form? Difficult to say, as Torelli used a large spectrum of form and styles. It is just clear that earlier works are more of a sonata sinfonia type with alternate slow and fast movement, as we have seen this afternoon. Last ones could be sort of suites with integration of elements of a French dance suite as gavotte movement for oboes, particularly. Torelli used generally trumpets in only 2 movements. If the piece is in 3 movements, 2 or 3 movements if it's in pieces with 5 or more movements. So it means we have it alternates slow, fast movement, but it alternates playing, rest for trumpet player, which is important because it's physically hard music, because it's D trumpet, and we know that the pitch was really high. And I noticed when we have listened the trumpet sonatas of the other project that the trumpeters are playing at 415 D. So the organ parts were certainly transposed down, but the original organ part, that's D major. So it means very short trumpet, like for the second Brandenburg, Bach, second Brandenburg. So necessary to have some rest. Okay. Used generally, the trumpeters play generally in fast movement. Okay. Last point I will develop is I will show a few elements about the savoir-faire of Torelli as talented composer to write such interesting music with so limited instrument as mine. And most of the example I will show are taken from the piece I have selected for the concert. First, I begin with a sinfonia we will not play in this program, but to show when it's very simple sinfonia to introduce something with one trumpet. Thematic element could be solo, duet, completely the thematic are most of the time short because it's like little fanfare to announcement. It creates a grid effect, but there is no virtuosity. We see in this sonata, which is in the archives in Dresden, after the introduction of the violin, the trumpet enters with a very simple motif, which is developed after. You see bar 17, and which is developed after bar 14, 15. So it's always by step. And the answer of violin, we have bar 13 and 14. You see, the trumpet played it, but later, 22, 23. It's always like that, little elements, and progressively complete, the trumpet feel comfortable to play and listen that the violin are playing. It's not directly a long phrase, very virtuose. It's not idiomatic for the instrument. So very intelligent from Torelli to know that and to write something which to simply sound. Now we arrive to one of the pieces we play in the Concerto, the G23, which is for 2 trumpets and strings. When Torelli use longer motifs, it's something which could be a trumpet duet, a few bars trumpet duet. To announce important mass, it's nice to have a trumpet duet, but the genius of Torelli is to integrate a trumpet duet into a more complete piece, into bigger development. So beginning of the first movement of this Sonata 23, the trumpets are playing this duet to the top C, so virtuose but very short shape. Few bars later, exactly the same, even if in between many things happen with the strings. And before the end of the piece, the same. So 3 times. So it's perfectly adapted to trumpet players who are able to play very good short things to announce events. But when they are able to do one motif well, it's no problem that they play 3 times in one movement. In the same Sinfonia, okay, that's the 3rd time. Beginning of the last movement, the same. We have the bass are playing bloom, bloom, just accompaniment. It's a trumpet duet. 1 time, the beginning, but after, bar 20, it came again. At the end of the movement, it came again. And 3 times, perhaps it's symbolic to use 3 times this motif. Sometimes the trumpets are just to do connection between 2 sections of the strings. For example, in the same, not here, but here it's another example, a short motif played by the trumpets, and just after, in the dominant by the strings, because in this register, it's impossible to have all the tones to play in the trumpet. So the trumpets use the same thematic elements as the strings, and that's the genius of Torelli, to show that, okay, limited instrument, they use the same thematic elements, even if it's a very simple one. Or, later in this movement, the 2 violins, but the trumpets answer the same. So it introduces a variety of in the sound. Right? There is an idea of orchestration, very modern idea of orchestration, and the trumpet could use the same thematic elements. In some other sonatas, like mostly solo sonatas, thematic elements could be longer and more developed, as in the Sinfonia G7, where there is a specific movement, just basso continuo, solo cello, and solo trumpet. The cello begins with, so the trumpeter has in the ears and could play at the high octave exactly the same melodic line, but never it will begin with directly the trumpet solo. It's too risky. In the next Sinfonia, the G8, same idea. Here it's just 1 bar. At the high octave, exactly the same. So the trumpeters has the melody in it and could begin without too much risk the second motif. Other composers in San Petronio use this system, the one movement with solo trumpet and solo violoncello. Sorry, I don't remember which one. After some time, the trumpet could begin alone, but it begins on the tonic and in the only a fifth of ambitus. So it's not, that is idiomatic for the instruments. The violins imitate in the dominant. In a register, the trumpet is not able to play. And eventually, it's in the Sinfonia G1 we will play tomorrow. Certainly one of the most developed for the trumpet and the most beautiful, but difficult to play. The trumpet is playing in the dominant, but in the high octave. It's the only possibility. It's not possible in... but you see, the trumpet doesn't play the complete motif of the beginning. It simplifies the motif. So everything is done with very great intelligence from Torelli to the adaptation of limited instruments. And I will finish, because perhaps with one piece where he went the most far for the trumpet, because I've said it played tonic dominant. We could play eventually to modulate for the D trumpet in G major with a few tones which are not so good, but with a good control, with a good player, it's possible. So it's the last movement of Symphonia G1, where the main theme by the strings to that the trumpet could have in the ears, but this motif is not playable by the trumpet. If I play, just have to put something. Forgot to put tuning beats, so it was not easy to play. So if I play the motif of the strings, you will listen. It's not, some sounds are not there on the trumpet. The strings are playing the main theme. What he does for the trumpet, but he changes the motif. So that's very subtle, and here it's playable. It continues, pom, pim, the string. And here, to introduce more variety, the strings have the main theme, but the trumpet had a commentary to that. With notes, she is able to play. Interesting after is to see modulation. The strings enter with modulate. What could play the trumpet? He put the pitch one tone more high to play in E, which is acrobatic for the trumpet, but possible to do with a good player. If I do in D major, we could do if we have a control of the 13 harmonic. After we have another another modulation. And that could do the trumpet E minor, which is extreme. But he can't write that because the trumpet had begun in the normal key of the trumpet, and progressively he push. If we did, in detail we have E minor. Finally, what's happened? Yeah. Again the tonic, and he concludes in the minor. And it's the end of one conclusion. But this piece is very specific to go so far. I will not speak about the only piece which is not in D but in C is this which use 4 trumpets and drums. So I think there is acoustical reason to raise the pitch one complete tone. I could conclude that the trumpet pieces you will discover this evening are only a small part of the production of Torelli, especially these with 2 trumpets, which perhaps needs really to be published in modern edition and more often played. Perhaps could it be my job in the next times. Late Edward Tarr concentrated on the solo pieces, certainly because of pressure by publishers for commercial reasons, and perhaps because there was interest for these solo repertoire in the trumpet world in the 17th, 18th, since the famous trumpeter Maurice André recorded and played on the modern piccolo trumpet this solo repertoire. One last thing, which could be a topic of research. First time I visited my colleague Ichino Conforzi in Bologna Conservatoire, I arrived in the stairs and I have seen that. No, it's a trumpeter with but the photo is not very clear, with a beautiful silver trumpet on some music written in D major, typical trumpet music. And it's now this painting in Bologna Music Museum. So, is this anonymous trumpeter, Giovanni Pellegrino Brandi, we have a name, who has played all this repertoire, that could be future research. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jean-Francois. With one eye on the watch and knowing that there's coffee outside, I would propose that any questions, remarks to Jean-Francois, we give outside with a coffee in hand, and we'll meet here again 4:15 sharp, so that we have a chance to not run off time completely. But thank you again, Jean-Francois.
Das ist cool. glasses this way. Yeah, I think it's good. Yeah. Maybe here. Okay. Okay.
May I ask for your attention so that we can go on with only 12 minutes late. This is for Deutsche Bahn. Fantastic. Switzerland, it would be impossible. So, for the last part of this, for me as an outsider, very interesting study day on Torelli. I have learned a lot, and I'm really looking forward to hear the music tonight and tomorrow again. Now in the last part, we have now another look on the pieces. We have heard already some from different angles, different perspectives, interesting things. I would like to introduce and welcome Federico Lanzellotti, who is now a colleague here in Basel at the university. He is working in this new project, Night Muse. We don't tell a lot about Night Muse because there will be a lot of conferences in the next 5-6 years, I don't know. It's a large project. He has studied in Bologna and Madrid and was a research fellow at the University of Padua and in Venice. And he edited the Opera Omnia of Bononcini and Tartini. So he is absolutely well informed about Torelli, I think. Please, Federico.
Thank you very much, and I would like to express my gratitude to Agnese Pavanello for inviting me to this study day, and it's a pleasure to meet you again after half a year, the last conference on Torelli in Bologna. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. The role of Giuseppe Torelli as a composer of sinfonias in Bolognese musical life is well documented, and some of the circumstances in which his works were requested have been investigated. Nevertheless, a comprehensive study of this branch of his production and an exhaustive exploration of the heterogeneous context of production and performance have yet to be undertaken. In this paper, I address various different issues related to the topic and call into question the use of the term sinfonia by Torelli. Torelli is presumed to have composed sinfonias for a variety of different contexts and situations. First of all, he wrote sinfonias for the annual fest of St. Anthony of Padua, the patron of Accademia Filarmonica, of which he was a member from 1684, as suonatore di violino. It is probable that he was regarded as one of the compositori di sinfonia, a subcategory of the compositori group, as is evidenced by a reference in the later statuti, ovvero costituzioni dei signori accademici filarmonici di Bologna, 1721. The sinfonias were composed by the author during the years 1692 to 1700, 1701, 1703 to 1704, and 1708, for the bombastic celebration in the church of San Giovanni Monte in Bologna. In addition to these sinfonias, Torelli wrote composition for other sacred contexts, particularly San Petronio Church, for which it is probable that he wrote pieces with one or several trumpets, as we have seen today. As attested by a letter from Giuseppe Corsi da Celano to Perti from Parma, dated 29 December 1787, Torelli's symphonies were also requested abroad for the use in church services at Santa Maria della Steccata. He also composed symphonies for other sacred contexts, in particular for San Petronio, as I said, and probably he wrote pieces also for academias and other Bolognese contexts. On the basis of entries on Torelli in the New Grove and Dizionario Biografico degli Italiani, Passadore Catalogs, and Gertinger's research, this slide includes the symphonies he wrote for Perti's operas, those appearing in the scores of Nerone Fatto Cesare and Furio Camillo, correspond to other pieces by Torelli, that are also independently attested. On the other hand, the Sinfonia for Astianate, probably Perti's opera for Pratolino in 1701, and the second piece without reference to a specific dramatic word are attested by two puzzling unique witnesses in Bologna. The 5 pieces are very heterogeneous in instrumentation, formal structure, and texture, and include 1, 2, or no trumpets. However, the attribution of the relatively short Sinfonia, which opens Perti Oratorio di Passione, to which Torelli may have contributed with 2 arias, remains doubtful. The second section of the 4-part string prelude of this oratorio has an incipit very close to Torelli's string sonata or Sinfonia A11-127 and Sinfonia A11-2.1. Although the instrumental writing is less exuberant, probably because of the specific purpose of the piece. Torelli wrote instrumental music for other compositions by Perti, including the symphonias for the motet Cessate Mortis Funera, and for a version of his Missa Octo Vocibus, one movement of which is taken from Sinfonia A9-1-6. Cases of contamination and practices of instrumental pasticcios and reworkings are also demonstrated by the Sinfonia Avanti la Messa, a later reworking ascribed to Perti, including 2 movements of string concerto a 4 A11-1-4, attested in autograph score in San Petronio archive. The first movement is also the introductory one of Torelli's Trio Sonata A3325, also attested in an alternative version as Sinfonia con tromba. The destination of the piece to the Mass is also underlined by the definition segue il Kyrie, that you can see squared in red, which is reported at the end of the composition. There are also 2 Sinfonia per l'Accademia, dated 1705 and 1707, respectively. In both cases, we can assume that they were composed for a large orchestra. The 7 surviving viola parts testify that 1705 Sinfonia was a multi-sectional piece intended for a large ensemble, including oboes and trumpets, with solos, for which a tachet is prescribed. The Sinfonia of 1707 makes explicit what can be assumed for the other piece. This Sinfonia, which survives in a partly autograph score in 39 parts, includes several instruments, among which 2 oboes, trumpets, trombones, 2 solo violin, slings, and continuo. The later long multi-sectional structure were probably intended to be performed in the space. The in nomine domini at the end of the composition may provide further evidence, but drawings of the time suggested the possible use of similar pieces in secular indoor or outdoor contexts, such as noble palaces or gardens equipped by apparatus, where sinfonia were used, or several occasions and concertante pieces were commonly performed. Furthermore, the 2 dates given on the scores, 1705 and 1707, are not among those reported in Penna's Chronologia or other archival sources. This could be an omission, as the Dizionario Biografico degli Italiani suggests, or it could suggest us the possibility that Torelli wrote this music for a different situation, such as a meeting or a special event for a Bolognese academy. Indeed, In 1705, for example, the Gelati organized an important festa at the Palazzo Isolani, attended by the city's aristocracy and important guests, among which Dukes of Modena and Brunswick. The Festa of Accademia dei Gelati of Bologna, held on 4th January to celebrate the marriage of Alamanno Isolani's sister to Count Alessandro Pepoli, for which a libretto and a calcographic representation were printed, included Introduzione e Intramezzi per musica. A serenata by Perti was performed with Torelli and Vitali playing the first and second solo violin. It is possible that music by Torelli was also included in this event. The libretto printed after the festival tells us that the performance of a spiritosa e dolce sinfonia was proposed at the beginning, followed by the first disquisition, and then the Serenata 3, Verone, Giunone, Minerva by Perti, divided in two sections, as it is very common in the serenatas of the time. We have a lot of examples from Giovanni Bononcini's Roman serenatas. It is interesting to note that also in 1707, Gelati organized a festa at the Tanari family palace, opened by a soave e maestoso concerto. In this case, the title in the source underlines that the Sinfonia per l'Accademia was intended for an academy, maybe, and not for a service in Accademia Philharmonica in San Giovanni in Monte, thus supporting the hypothesis of a secular destination of this piece, linked to a well-established annual academic gathering such as Gelati Accademia. The codicological state of the autograph score, made up of heterogeneous choirs sewn together, leads to the hypothesis that some sections of the piece could have been conceived for one event and adapted for another, after a revision, on the basis of which the parts were copied. It is also possible to hypothesize a link with another academy abroad, among which, for example, the Paduan Accademia dei Ricovrati, which in 1705 promoted an academy inaugurated by Vaghissima Mirabile Sinfonia di Strumenti da Fiato. But the codicological characteristics of the musical source in the San Petronio archive let us imagine a strong link with the Bolognese area. This table summarizes the composition printed as sinfonias. As in the case of his contemporaries, the use of the term is extremely flexible and generally indicates an instrumental composition, as in Opus 3, where the title Sinfonia changes to Sonata in the summary of the part books. Even if 3 pieces are written in 4 parts with the alto viola, the multi-instrumental writing dominates this collection, which shine in real parts and lies in the tradition of instrumental sonata, late 17th century instrumental sonata, with several examples in the production of the Bononcinis, Vitalis, Colombi, and so on. However, another version of Sonata Sinfonia number 11 is also attested in the San Petronio archive with doublings and ripieno parts, up to 16 different part books, in order to transform the sonata into a concerto writing with concertino and tutti. It is interesting to note that a copy of the 12th sonata with 3 violins, violoncello, and basso continuo has also survived, but in this case, the parts do not include doublings, but only different parts for basso continuo instrumentation. It is also intriguing to observe the interchangeability of the term sinfonia and concerto, which in Torelli's case also reveal more about the style of the piece. Opus 5 contains 6 trio sonatas entitled Sinfonias and 6 concertos in 4 parts with alto viola. The style of these is closer to Sinfonia in 4 parts, except for the last, which is much closer to solo concerto writing. It is not the case that a part of Concerto Opus 5, number 12, is entitled both Sonata and Sinfonia, in a late 17th century manuscript in Archive of Filippini in Bologna. In fact, Torelli prescribed for the 4 parts concertos the possibility to doubling all parts to discover his intention. And this intention may have been the same for some of the four-part sonatas of Opus 3, as the parts of Sonata 11 in San Petronio may suggest us. It is common in concerto Symphony Opus 5 to find episodes of strong cohesion, highlighted by echo effects. There are sections in which dialogue between the parts is encouraged and imitative or antiphonal structure are used, but the lines are always much more uniform than in multi-instrumental concertos. Very different is the writing of the trio sonatas, in which the dialogue between the parts is much more developed, as we can see in the fourth. With the exception of Concerto 6, the homophonic texture dominates the other pieces, and it is very clear in the beginning of Concertos number 1 and number 4, where two violins go in thirds, and there is a clear division between the upper part of the score and the lower parts of the score, which is common in several early Italian symphonies, where the viola part often plays a minor role after the basso or second violin part is sometimes cut off. I won't say more because more has been heard about this collection today. Similar consideration can be proposed about some of Concerti Opus 6, where a predominantly homophonic texture is required and the composer asks that part be duplicated or played by 3 or 4 players in other parts to reveal my intention. It's very close to the other note in the previous collection. Compared to Opus 5, the dialogue between the upper voices seems much more developed, and the first violin is generally much more elaborated, often reaching a solistic role, as we have seen today. Closer to the Concerto Sinfonias Opus 5 are the Concerto number 5 in G minor, the 7th in C minor, and the 11th in B flat major, even if the dimension of dialogue between the upper voices predominates over the vertical idea. In both collections, Torelli uses the term concerto for 4 parts piece, which makes it possible to create a connection to his manuscript output, where this title is widely used among composition in 4 parts in sinfonia style. The manuscript tradition also shows an inconsistent use of the term sinfonia, and several concertos with one or more solos, among them the impressive Sinfonia 10-1-1 we have seen, are included. Some of the pieces call for different choruses and of instruments, while the Sinfonia A9-1-5 with 2 oboes, 2 trumpets and strings emphasizes the use of a concerto grosso form. The order table permits to list 12 compositions in 4 parts that can be assigned to the category of sinfonias for their writing and texture. In Passadore's catalog, they are divided between section 8 and section 11, and the latter category includes sinfonias and sonatas for strings, as well as concertos in 4 parts with soloist, opera and oratorio sinfonias, and works of doubtful attribution, such as the Sinfonia Avanti la Messa arranged by Perti. There is a lot of confusion if we have this perspective. Some pieces are repeated in different categories, and the distinction between composition for strings and compositions for orchestra, which is clearly stated in Passadore's catalog, seems misleading when one considers that the latter category includes just one piece, the Sinfonia A11-1, which also require a couple of horns di rinforzo. The composition opens with a short introduction, marked adagio e spicco. We talked about spicco spiccato this morning, in the parts, followed by an allegro thematically linked to the Sinfonia of Perti's La Passione del Redentore, whose imitative incipit is developed in parallel writings for the violins, independent from the other accompaniment lines, which remain in the background. The composition evolves through the juxtaposition of episodes that follow a direct harmonic path, emphasizing the brightness of purely instrumental writing over the formal development. This compositional behavior, the condensation of slow movements into an adagio of few bars, and the light and lovely final movements recall the writings of contemporary operatic sinfonias, and at the same time, the form and writing of early sinfonia in its multiple declination and use. Among the pieces listed in this table, a different situation of a source may suggest different performance solutions. Indeed, in some cases, such of the pieces in the Bodleian library, only one book per single line survives, and composition for which several part books were very produced, including the case of Concerto opus 6, number 1, preserved in San Petronio archive, in a different situation with 35 different parts. Generally, the source in San Petronio archive shows that the proliferation of doubletten is a phenomenon transversal to the whole production of Torelli, and it is quite common in string sinfonias and concertos in 4 parts, usually with 2 or 3 parts per line. It is clearly demonstrated by Sinfonia A 11.125, characterized by pointé introduction in ternary tempo, reminiscent of the Concerto alla Francese, opus 5, number 1. Parallel violin lines and an homophonic cohesive writing also characterize the Concerto a 4 A11.1.2, of which the San Petronio archive preserves 2 parts for each lines plus basso continuo. The architecture of the composition is similar, in which the short central adagio is opened by a movement based on echo effects. Among the other interesting phenomena that can be highlighted is the circulation of movements between different sinfonias and some case of pastiche and reworkings. For example, 2 movements of Sinfonia A11.2.1 reappear modified in Sinfonia A11.127. It is very interesting from my point of view. It is also worth mentioning that the Sinfonias a 4 of Oxford used the viola with substituted viola part with a 3rd violin part, following a tradition well attested in Italy, in particular in Modena, and traceable in instrumental composition and cantatas by Giovanni Battista Vitali or other composers at the court of Francesco II d'Este, to which the Oxford source is linked, and that it is also attested in Last Torelli's Sinfonias opus 3. Also, the use of unisoni violin is quite linked to the first season of instrumental sinfonia, the use of unisono violins. It is also very interesting that some of the stylistic and textural aspects highlighted in the a 4 repertoire are common to opera sinfonias attributed to Torelli. Even though Passadore classifies 3 of them as concertos because of the presence of 1 or 2 trumpets, this piece is not far from the Italian opera and serenata sinfonias of the late 17th and early 18th century. Sinfonies, for example, by Perti, by the Bonocinis, Gabrielli, Pollarolo, and also Alessandro Scarlatti. In fact, the role of the trumpets in Torelli's opera sinfonias is just to create a dialogue with unisono violins and to contribute to the timbrical aspects of the piece, playing sometimes probably also a symbolic role, for example, evoking some military, some war scenes, which are very common in opera of that time, drama per music of that time. The presence of concertante instances is also evident in the Sinfonia, that later description linked to the opera L'Astianate. The work has only 3 movements, but the score lists 4 additional sections, including a capriccio for solo violin. It's not clear whether the other sections were added as a result of a later revision, but it's unlikely that the piece, used as an opera sinfonia, didn't include also a second part of the piece, creating this so effective dramatic dynamicity. just in three movements, it appears like a two-dimensional piece. Where with the fourth addition, it becomes more interesting. It is certain that Torelli's contribution to the first steps in the development and codification of the Italian concerto di piano and sinfonie a quattro as a genuine and increasingly independent instrumental genre during the 18th century lies precisely in this ability to combine different approaches to instrumental writing. His imaginative and effective way of fusing solistic instances with pure orchestral writing and of combining formal structure and timbrical effects and textual convention is the heart of new instrumental language that was developed in the decades immediately after Torelli's production, Torelli's period. I hope that the new perspective I propose in this paper will help to shed light on the relevance of Torelli's contribution to the creation of new instrumental idioma, and to the history not only of concerto, as we know, but also to the development of further 18th century forms, among which early sinfonie in four parts. So we can conclude that more than 70 years after the publication of Giegling's book and the first rediscovery of this musician, Torelli still has much to reveal and future surprise await us. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Federico. Questions, remarks?
Yeah, I'm just always very much interested if you have the possibility to compare pieces which are in handwritten as manuscripts and then in print. And there's some kind of movement, as some movement are integrating new conceptual ideas, so to speak, of the form. Yes, I would maybe could you comment a little more about this Sonata 3, which take this movement, or do I remember right?
Yeah.
Rightly?
There are several of these phenomena of migrating of movements in Torelli's output.
Because I would be really interested to understand which kind of transition we can observe in the idea of formal structure. I don't know, something. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Agnese, for your question. And this aspect is really fascinating for me, the idea that Torelli come back to his composition and other people works on his composition. And San Petronio archive have a treasure. If you go there, you can find different versions and also the different forms. And for example, the Sinfonia from Astianate has two different forms, one in 3 parts and one in 7 parts, so it's very, very different. And it happens also for Sinfonia in 3 parts. You said it happens that the piece in 3 parts migrate into a sort of concerto form. And this is very interesting because you can see the works of the transformation of the work, which is attested only in the manuscript tradition. And I think that if we see Torelli's output from a different perspective, from a transversal perspective, with considering different instrumental genres, we can have a more ample idea of his contribution to the development of these forms. And this suggests some steps of these changes, of the possibility to adapt pieces to different situations. Probably several of these pieces were used in different situations, in church sonatas, in serenatas and other secular contexts, and changed in time, changed in form. I don't know if it's...
It's a very important point because we really don't have such material in general for this time. And the San Petronio is just fantastic because we have the possibility to see these kind of transformations and
the multi-use of musical material, yes.
Yeah. It's a pity because it's not simple to see sources in San Petronio archive. It's very, very difficult. And yes, it's a pity because they have a huge quantity of sources, but you can see just 3 a day, and it's not simple.
But that means that further generations of musicologists will have some work to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again, Federico. And because some of the musicians have to leave for prepare for the Generalprobe, I start already to introduce our last speaker, which is Chiara Cattani. It's again, if you look at the title, there's another point of view, another perspective on Opus 8. We have heard already one of the perhaps most or very interesting compositions, collections by Torelli, and she concentrates on concerti grossi and solo violin concertos. And she has a different background because she is a maestra al cembalo. That means she's a keyboard player, all kinds of keyboards, and she is professor for this instrument in Ravenna, and I found even in the internet other places as well, like Cosenza, Bologna, and co-repetition in Bolzano. Yes, so many worked places, and she has just been appointed artistic and musical director of the Baroque Orchestra Accademia Montis Regalis, and she has also, in this respect, some new functions in the Festwochen Alter Musik in Innsbruck. So she is a practitioner, harpsichord player, but with a certain musical background, which already is documented in a book about Giuseppe Sarti. And now it's already set, and please, Chiara, it's your floor.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Agnese Pavanello for this invitation. Thank you. So, we have already read this word many times today, and with these famous words of Quant, I introduced the last work of Torelli, opus number 8, published posthumously in 1709 by his brother Felice, and dedicated to Marquis Stefano Alimacarani, Knight of Santo Stefano. The genesis of this work is in Bologna, where once again, after his stay in Germany, Torelli was in the last years of his life as a violinist, concertmaster, and composer at the chapel of San Petronio. The composer's words at the opening of the collection of concertos are as follows. I warn you that in order to play these my concertos, it is necessary that the violins of the concertino be alone, without any doubling, to avoid greater confusion. If then you wish to multiply the other instruments for reinforcement, this indeed is truly my intention, and live happily. Torelli Opus 8 consists of 12 concertos and is divided into 2 symmetric parts. The first 6 concertos are concerti grossi, featuring 2 violins that play alone. The second part of the work sees a solo violin. The purpose of my interpretation is certainly not to establish a primacy of the Veronese composer on the birth of the concerto genre, as there are too many ambiguities in the term and meanings given to it, but rather to highlight the specificities of this publication and underline points of contact and divergence compared to Corelli's opus number 6 regarding the first 6 concertos. Finally, after a quick analysis of the structure of the second part of the work, I aim to identify the elements that have been absorbed by later literature with a specific focus on Johann Sebastian Bach. A comparison between Corelli's concerti grossi and those of Torelli seems necessary. Both are posthumous publications, with Torelli's appearing earlier in 1709, while Corelli's from 1714. The affinities between the two publications, which I will highlight below, lead us to believe that in some way one of them was aware of the other's material. And despite the editorial primacy of Torelli's work, the absolutely more credible option is that it was Torelli who came into contact with Corelli's scores, that later became part of the Opus 6. We can deduce this from a famous letter that Giacomo Antonio Perti sent to Giovanni Battista Giardini, dated March the 10th, 1687, preserved today at the State Archive of Modena, with the words, the oratorio for 6 voices with the concertino and concerto grosso in the manner of Rome. So, 27 years before Corelli's Opus 6 appeared, the concerto grosso was already a custom in Rome, and Perti, in Bologna, was aware of it. There is also the equally fundamental testimony of Moffat, who states that since the 1680s, he has been listening to concerts by Corelli performed in Rome by a very large number of musicians. Probably these were not true concerti grossi, but trio sonatas performed with orchestral forces, but it is certainly plausible that Torelli was familiar with the Roman style. As for the structure of Torelli's concertos, it is quite linear and relates to the church form. We set aside for a moment, just a moment, concerto number 6, which presents some differences. The first 5 open with a fast movement, a vivace, is the case of concertos number 1 and 3, or an allegro, 2, 4, and 5. This is followed by a slow movement, which in the case of concertos number 1, 3, 4, 5, has an A-B-A1 structure, with a faster movement in the middle and a small reprise of the slow at the closing. Finally, the last movement for all 5 concertos is an allegro. Therefore, the structure is regular and centered on 3 movements. Concertos by Corelli, on the other hand, taking into consideration just the first part, the first 8, directly related to the church style, have a more articulated structure and a sequence of 4 or 5 movements. Each concerto has its own distinct individuality. Delving into the individual movements, let us analyze the most commonly used procedures by Torelli in the treatment of the 2 instruments of the concertino, their relationship with the concerto grosso, and observe whether we find contrast or similarity with Corelli. The violins of the concertino proceed in an imitative manner or homorhythmically in parallel thirds and sixths. If they proceed in an imitative manner, one responds to the other, or each of the 2 instruments separates from the other and is accompanied only by the bass, as this is especially the tendency in the later concerti grossi. We observe a similar treatment of the violins by Corelli. This is parallel third. However, I emphasize that Torelli always treats the 2 violins equally, while Corelli sometimes gives space only to the first violin of the concertino and uses the second in an harmonic function within the concerto grosso. The bass line in Torelli has a function of harmonic support. Occasionally, it offers passages in 8 notes, walking bass, but it never has an independent thematic value or a predominant importance compared to the violins of the concertino. Corelli often leaves more space for cello of the concertino, even with passages in 16 notes. Next point. Turning to the relationship between the solo violins and the ripieno, or reinforcement violins, The thematic, melodic contribution brought by the two violins of the concertino is never taken up or concluded according to the affirmation negation procedure of the concerto grosso. The rhythmic material can sometimes be reused, but often the concertino brings new material in contrast to the tutti. To a passage in 8 notes of concerto grosso, the concertino answers with passages in 16th notes. To a brilliant passage of the concerto grosso, the violins contrast with a softer thematic idea. Corelli, on the other hand, we know, often makes the concerto grosso repeat what was previously proposed by the concertino, creating an effect of great sound differentiation, or continues the same thematic idea, allowing it to flow from the solo to tutti. In Torelli, the concertino is accompanied only by the bass and never by the concerto grosso, so much so that the part of the reinforcement violins never differs from the concertino. Corelli, on the other hand, allows the concerto grosso to also play the continuo for the solis, creating the harmonies. Homorhythmic beginnings of the entire concerto grosso are not as frequently used by Torelli as by Corelli, although we can see a couple of brief examples, especially at the beginning of second movements. Fugato style is a device widely used by both Corelli and Torelli. In Torelli, it mainly involves the first and second violins, in some cases also the violas, and in one case the entire concerto grosso, including the bass. It should be noted that Torelli specifies at the beginning of Opus 8 which concertos require the viola obbligata and which have the viola at discretion, at beneplacito. The concertos with the viola at discretion are the majority, number 1, 2, 4, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Use of the concertato style, derived from cori battenti. This is more used by Corelli than by Torelli, and in Torelli the use is greater in the second series of concertos, those for a solo violin. Use of progression, very broad in both Corelli and Torelli, both within the soli and between soli and tutti. For Corelli, I underline a beautiful scheme of a progression based on a romanesca. Echo repetition, also widely employed in both works. Torelli is less generous than Corelli in terms of dynamic indications, but when he does use them, it is to highlight repetitions to be played more softly in echo. And I underline also ritornello, we know, indicates the representation of the tutti with the same thematic material to interrupt the soli, used by both composers. And rhythm derived from chamber music, this occurs in the concertos of Opus 8 by Torelli, as well as in the church concertos of Corelli, where there are movements derived from dance that are not explicitly mentioned in the title. For example, the jig concluding the second concerto by Torelli. Virtuosic writing for the solo violins. We find this in both Corelli and Torelli, perhaps with more virtuosic display in Torelli compared to Corelli, who, despite being known as the Orpheus of the violin, doesn't write to the limit of difficulty. In Torelli, the presence of passages from the so-called perfidia, from per fides through the strings, is highlighted and involves the repetition of brief figurations on scales, arpeggios, or trills, either on a pedal of the bass or without accompaniment as a sort of cadenza or an early caprice. Concerto number 6 has been set aside. Here, Torelli draws parallels with Corelli's production, titled Pastorale per il Santissimo Natale, Pastoral for Holy Christmas, just like Corelli's concerto number 8, Opus 6. The structure of Corelli's concerto is much more varied than that of Torelli. Torelli, following the classic 3-movement structure, simply adds a grave of only 4 bars on a bass pedal in the opening position. It then continues with a vivace, a largo, and a final vivace. The tonality is the same between Corelli and Torelli, G minor. But the pastorale that concludes Corelli's concerto is a largo in 12/8 in G major. Torelli, on the other hand, remains faithful to G minor in all movements, and the first vivace is in 12/8 with long bass pedals. The final vivace is in 2/4, still includes the use of triplets and long notes held mainly by the basses. And we note that it is not so common to find a pastorale in a vivace tempo. Other Italians who have written concerti grossi, Manfredini, Locatelli, Antonacci, Sammartini, have used the form of pastorale, but with a slow tempo and in G major. Now we go to the second part, to concertos for solo violin. The structure of the concertos for solo violin from number 7 to 12 confirms what we have already seen for concerti grossi. Although 3 concertos don't have any tempo indication for the first movement, they are vivace, allegro, and there is always a lively and brilliant allegro as the closing movement of the concerto. In a central position, we have this case. In concertos number 7, 9, and 11, there is a slow movement, adagio or largo, followed by a brief allegro left to the solo violin, accompanied by the bass. After that, there is a reprise of the slow tempo of small proportion. Let's note that in concerto number 11, Torelli does not seem to specify too meticulously the difference between largo and adagio, as the reprise of the slow movement, previously defined largo and staccato, is later named adagio. In concerto number 12, however, the central movement opens with an adagio, followed by a vivace for violin and bass, and concludes not with the coda of the initial adagio, but with the largo, of a different conception and a calmer tempo compared to the adagio. Concerto number 8, which is also the shortest overall, sees the adagio as an attacca in relation to the previous allegro. This case is particular because this second movement is divided into 3 parts of very brief proportions, marked by a fermata at their end. The last part is again called adagio, but has a different tempo compared to the previous adagio. Concerto number 10, on the other end, presents a central movement without tripartition, and it is a largo staccato. As for the tonality, the first 3 of this second part are in minor keys, while the last 3 are in major keys. Moving into the individual movements of the concertos, the lines already followed in the concerti grossi are confirmed. The preference for fugato beginnings, which rarely involve other voices beyond the first and second violins. In some cases, the imitation also involves the viola, and in some cases, not the viola, but the bass. The movements always begin with the tutti, except in the case of concerto number 8, whose first movement starts with a solo. As for the solos, their contribution is always melodically new compared to what is stated in the tutti. The writing for the violin becomes increasingly dense and technically demanding. It presents more rhythmic variety, always differentiated from the tutti, and brilliantly combines singability with various technical difficulties, particularly the use of double stops and combinations of bowing. The extent of the solo is gradually increasing at the expense of the role left to the tutti. It is also worth noting the slightly more pronounced use by Torelli compared to the first part of the work of the humorism of the tutti, and a greater liveliness in writing for the bass, which is no longer just a functional harmonic skeleton for the solo violin, but carries a melodic contribution and greater interaction with the soloist. Here we can see some of the technical difficulties and combination of bowing. In the final part of my presentation, I would like to examine the roles that Torelli may have played as a composer of concertos for solo violin and establish whether there are points of contact between Torelli's concertos and those of Bach. We know that the period Bach spent in Weimar from 1708 to 1717 represents his personal journey in Italy, having access to the court's music library, rich in works by Italian composers, including Torelli. Moreover, Johann Gottfried Walther, a distant cousin of Bach, had already initiated the practice of transcribing Italian concertos for solo keyboard, including Corelli, Albinoni, and Torelli himself, whose composition circulated easily in Germany since he had worked in Ansbach and Berlin. It is Walther who provides the first biography of Torelli, mentioning the unfortunately lost opus number 7, Capricci musicali per camera for violin and viola or accigliuto. Narrowing down the field of action, I will examine Bach's concerto in A minor BWV 1041, which, due to its comparable dimensions to those of Torelli's concertos, allows for a more direct comparison. For the analysis of the form, I will make a direct comparison for all three movements, and finally, I will make some general considerations regarding the violin. For the first movement, I choose as a comparison the first movement of Torelli's Concerto number 9. Borrowing terms from oratory, we see that both the concertos begin with an exordium, which coincides with the first tutti, and that from the initial key, it shifts to the tonality of the fifth degree. The narratio opens in both cases with the solo of the violin. Torelli leaves the violin alone, accompanied by the continuo, and after 6 bars he reintroduces the theme of the tutti in a fugato style in the same key, reversing the subject and the answer between the first and second violins, and again closing on the minor fifth degree. All solos are accompanied by the continuo. The representation of the concerto's grosso theme is in the relative measure key. Bach opens the narratio with the solo of the violin, using the strings as if they were a written continuo and allowing the solo of the violin to flow while the other 4 parts evoke a hint of the initial theme. He also reaches the theme in the relative measure key, C, and at the end of the tutti makes a cadence in E minor to resume the solo of the violin in E minor, parallel to that in A minor after the first tutti. Torelli, on the other hand, proposes a more substantial solo of the violin that starts from G major and comes back to E minor with broken arpeggios and long passages in 16th notes, never renouncing expressiveness. The last section for both is the confirmation of the initial theme in the key of the initial structure. I compare the second movement of Bach's concerto in A minor with the second movement largo and staccato of Torelli's concerto number 10. In C major for Bach, the tonality of the dominant in major mode for Torelli. The initial progression is similar for both, featuring an homorism between the violins. I highlight symmetries in the treatment of the solo violin, which first presents a small motif before immediately giving space to the repetition of the tutti. Then the soloist takes the lead and establishes a dialogue with the string quartet. Bach and Torelli decided to use a unique rhythmic cell for tutti, which in Bach's case runs throughout the second movement, while In Torelli's case, it interrupts with its verticality the horizontal flow of the solo voice. Bach, starting from C major, touches G major and D minor. Torelli starts in E major with a single touch on B minor. Now I compare the last movement of Bach with the last movement of Torelli's Concerto number 12, Allegro ma non presto, in D major. We can note the fugato beginning of the exordium for both Bach and Torelli. In Bach, the four voices enter in the order of first violin, second violin, bass, and viola. In Torelli, the first violin center, followed by the second and the viola. The bass serves as harmonic support. Immediately, some similarities in the writing of the two composers for the solo can be noted, which leads to a decrease in values in 16 notes. Both composers make a similar choice in the reprise of the theme, both in the key of the dominant. The solos continue to highlight the technical abilities of the violinist. Both movements reprise the theme in the original key. I underline the words by Torelli here, sopra il manico, to mean shift on the fingerboard, shifting position. Speaking therefore of the form, we can summarize some of the most evident and obvious similarities and some differences. The two composers have in common the alternation between soli and tutti, a circular structure involving the repetition of the first tutti at the close of the movement and a round of modulations to the relative measure tonality and the tonality of the dominant and other closing tonalities. The role that both Bach and Torelli give to the violin is to introduce new thematic and rhythmic figurations and to entrust it with melodic themes different from those enunciated in tutti. A final important consideration must be made about basso continuo. I recorded these concertos as harpsichordist and maestro a cembalo, and I have to say that harmonization is already complex in Torelli and never obvious. Highlighting instead the differences, we can note that Bach, in the first movement of Concerto 1041, decides not to put a clear dividing line between solo and tutti. The violin continues to be soloist even while the strings enunciate again the theme of tutti. In Bach, the solo violin is accompanied by the entire concerto grosso and not just but continuo, as Torelli prefers. The dynamics are introduced by Bach to underline the difference between solo and tutti. Piano means solo, forte means tutti. Finally, I found that Torelli in these concertos often entrusts the violin with new melodic ideas for each solo. Bach, on the other hand, outlines a more structured form in which the theme of the solo is also repeated in the closing tonalities to which the modulations of tutti lead. Some more general consideration can be made by comparing these early Italian experiments in concerto genre by Torelli with the already mature works of Bach. We note a great punctuality and precision on Bach's part in the choice of articulation, particularly for the solo violin. Not all movements have the same precision, but Torelli is also quite explicit, as can be seen in the allegro that comes after the adagio of the seventh concerto, as well as in many solos in each movement. The highest note for the violin written by Bach is E5 in fourth position. Torelli reaches F5 in fifth position several times in concerto number 11 in F major, both in the first and last movements. And again, as mentioned earlier, the fugato beginning is a characteristic of both composer and also the use of form derived from dance, as is the case with the jig that concludes Bach's concerto in A minor, exactly like the third movement of Torelli's Concerto Grosso. Another consideration should be made regarding the extensive use by both composers of the same lexicon of melodic and harmonic formulas as catalogued by Gördingen. Some are cited, but please consider this only as a sample of the impressive usage. For example, Monti
and Fonti. They features events grouped by two in a descending or ascending sequence. This is a very beautiful and long monte in Bach. The Meyer scheme, tonic, dominant, dominant, tonic. It features 4 events presented in pairs of 2. We go from the tonic to the dominant, and from dominant we come back to tonic. Passus Duriusculus, a chromatic step in a descendant way. It's the beginning of concerto number 7. Prinner form is an answer to an opening scheme. We have a form of stepwise descent from scale degree 4 to scale degree 1. To conclude my talk, I would like to make one last consideration. We know that Bach deepened the Italian repertoire. He got to know it well, he studied it, and extrapolated the compositional forms from it. He came into contact with the music of Torelli, but also of Corelli, Vivaldi, Albinoni, and so on. The question I ask myself is, what are Torelli's specificities that distinguish him from others? Why Torelli? I noticed the answer I tried to give to myself is that I noticed that an excellent level of technical preparation is required of the violinist, and that Torelli explores all possibilities in all concertos. There is an a very extreme variety of the rhythm, and an interest in writing out ornaments for the soloist with real notes, so that sometimes we can add some diminution or variations, but often we don't need. And I then observed that while, for example, some of Vivaldi concertos are harmonically extremely linear and clear, Torelli's, as I said before, show a very accurate harmonic conception, and the continuist is required to be able to solve some intricate points. In addition, Torelli succeeded in combining a writing that is also often chordal and therefore vertical, with a phrasing that is always horizontal. Finally, as we have seen, Torelli makes much use of rhetorical figures and opening and closing patterns. So I can conclude that Torelli and Bach speak a common language. Thank you for your attention.
Chiara, thank you very much. All music ends in Bach.
Hello.
Any comments, questions to Chiara?
We can go to the concert, to the general probe.
It's always difficult after a long day. We've heard a lot about Torelli. And now other things, to find something inspiring, but we need just a little bit of time of thinking.
Very short question about performance practice. If you had the impression, recording these pieces, that Stile Pieno of Gasparini is particularly pregnant in this kind of repertoire, if you used it both harmonically and in the use of match notes.
Yes, I use it a lot, with a lot of acciaccatura also inside, because Torelli writes out acciaccatura, so it is possible to continue to add acciaccatura in our realization. And Stile Pieno, yes, I suggest to use, and in my recording I use it a lot.
Okay. With 13 dots.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
I would like just to add some remarks. Michael Talbot was the first scholar who postulated to compare Torelli's concertos with Bach music. in his article, some little known pieces by Torelli in British Library. And thanks for doing it as the first. And I made such comparison before coming here as well. And I would say that as far as we concern the formal aspects, Torelli's concerto forms, the ritornello forms, are much clearer, much more plastic, and in Opus 8, much more standardized than Bach. I'm afraid that for Michael Talbot, some of Bach's ritornello forms from his solo concertos or Brandenburg concertos wouldn't be the example of ritornello forms. And Bach, as we know, was great contrapuntist. So in his ritornello forms, as you showed in some instances, he's going to organize more homogenic entity in the movement. So that's why he contrary to Torelli, that's why he don't want to resign from inner voices during solo episodes, because he wants to add new counterpoints or to reuse the material from ritornellos just to accompany new melodies in solo episodes. But in some concertos, as I remember well, in E major solo violin concerto, Bach is not so German in the sense of Ordnung, because it may be the first movement is the ritornello form is not very practical, because there is repetition of 50 bars with 2 solo episodes and ritornellos. So not so I wanted just to say that we are still debating what is the ritornello form, what is the definition of the real ritornello form, and what are the similarities between Bach and Torelli. And even in this article of Talbot, he made some citations from Torelli's chamber works with melodies which were reused in Bach's music. So we are still waiting for more research comparing Bach and Torelli music. But that's the good conclusion, that if Bach reused Torelli's music or modeled somehow on his music, so that's Torelli wasn't so poor composer when we heard when we read in Hutchings' monograph.
Yeah, thank you. No, please speak.
I just wanted to thank you for doing that comparison, because to step outside of Torelli and look at Bologna more in general, I think Bach was very aware of what happened in Bologna. Even if you compare some of his sacred works with some of the Colonna compositions, it's really there. It's part of his musical intertext for sure. And I think we often forget that Bach knew what was going on very much around, including Bologna, not just Rome or Venice. So thank you for confirming that.
Okay. Then perhaps this is really the end, even if you're now ending with Bach again. It's really fascinating. I just will conclude this afternoon session, and with this the whole day, Studientag on Torelli. We have heard a lot of very interesting papers and insights, especially different aspects on instrumental sounds in Bologna, San Petronio. And before I gave the last word to Agnese, who has organized all this, and I would like to thank you, Agnese, for doing this. And I want also to thank the many people and hands in the background helping. Birgit is already gone, but Katrin is there, Andy is there, and Esther, who helped for the organization.
Yes, I wanted to thank from my side as well. First, thank you very much all the speakers who came to Basel to join us for this event, and I'm very, very happy about what I could hear here and this interaction and what you could learn and what could share in this day. I also want to thank you very much, especially Birgit Leber, all the logistic parts. Also she took care of everything, and help us here as well. Also Esther Müller again for streaming and technical side, together with Andreas Westermann, Katrin Menzel as well. Thank you so much, and thank you also for the support for our head team, also Leitung der Schola Cantorum, for supporting this initiative. Thank you. So we are ready for the general rehearsal today. So I'm very it's a special possibility to hear our students playing with Amandine Bayer, Leila Chayek, and Enrico Gatti and Jean-Francois Madeuf. This is really a special combination on high-profile musicians. So we can go and enjoy the music after this day together. Thank you so much again.
If you don't, just follow us.